Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in these last days. The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. End quote. Karl Marx, the communist man. Wait a second, that's from the Bible. Wait, this must be some kind of mistake. The Bible would never say, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Ronnie, please make it stop. Ho ho ho, merry times to all, and welcome back. Hope your bellies are warm and your hearts are full. Wait, not bellies warm, I meant the opposite. In the spirit of the holidays, today we're going to talk about the most famous book of all time, the Motel Side Table book. I'm sure we've all seen some episodes of the anime when we were kids, but today we're going to focus on the manga, specifically the Rebirth arc. Every now and again, usually when I'm doom scrolling on Twitter, I'll come across something Jesus said or did and go, wait, roll that back. Jesus really said fuck rich people? Yo, that dude was based. And after having enough of these revelations, that's a little bit of a Bible joke for you, it struck me that his teachings might be condemned as far left were he alive today. So today, on this merriest of nights, I want to go on a journey with y'all. Let's take a look together through Jesus' teachings to see if there's anything he said that rails so wildly against American neoliberalism that, were Jesus alive today, he'd get labeled a filthy commie. If this doesn't get you in the Christmas spirit, I don't know what will. Without further ado, let's go, go, go! Get it? Like, ho, ho, ho. Oh God, that sucked. Part 1. What makes a commie? And other qualifying points. I want to hammer this point home early. Applying modern terms to historical figures can be a fool's errand. Fellow YouTuber and dry humor king Sean has a great pair of videos exploring the failures of applying modern terms like feminism or immigration to ancient Rome. The burden of proof to claim something like, this old thing is exactly the same as this new thing, is extremely high. Because societies throughout history have such vastly different contexts and value systems, it's never a simple comparison. Why do I bring this up? Because I realize that our current political framework is vastly different than 2,000 years ago. Communism was very specifically born in response to capitalism, which didn't exist in J-Man's time. So to use the presence of communist policies as my baseline for whether or not Jesus was a commie would be unproductive. So the question becomes, what specific parameters am I looking for? While I am curious to see what ways Jesus' teachings might literally reflect tenets of communism, for this video I'm going to simply define communist Jesus as anything that conservative Americans would label communism. Though Jesus might not call for seizing the means of production, if he, for example, calls wealth hoarding bad, plenty of Americans would call that communist sympathizing. And bam, in that moment, we'd have Comrade Jesus. And while my application of what qualifies as communist to conservative-ish Americans may sound broad, keep in mind Republicans have spent years making communism apply to basically everything they don't like. Depending on who you ask, the civil rights movement was communism, a market-based alternative to universal health care is communism, beloved Christmas classic It's a Wonderful Life is communism, measures to prevent the spread of a deadly virus is communism, a marginally higher tax plan is communism, global warming is communism, and evolution is communism.
Evolution is one of the strongest tools of Marxism.
So if you want to blame someone for my expanded definition of communism in this video, if at some point you think to yourself, that's not technically communism, Jesus is just critical of greed, you need a better definition. Maybe you should take that issue up with the folks who've held on to Red Scare tactics as a cheap rhetorical tool to attack anything they don't like for the better part of 80 years, as well as these schmucks who buy into and reuse the Republican framing. If anything other than a 100% privatized, low-tax free market counts as radical socialism in your realm of politics for some reason, then I get to call your guy a commie if he even slightly disagrees with you. Them's the rules, sweetie, okay? Also, in this video, I'll mainly be looking at what Jesus had to say about money. That is not to say communism is divorced from identity politics, but I find that Jesus' identity politics don't translate well. Here's an example. Jesus did his part to break down the gendered hierarchies of his time. Women weren't supposed to talk in public, and they were supposed to wear headscarves and shit. But Jesus came around and showed great kindness to women, at times scolding crowds that wanted him to accost or even stone women. Incredibly based and PogChamp of him. Though I couldn't find anything of him breaking down the dress code of the time, so that's, kinda cringe. But anyway, if we accept that Jesus was ahead of his time on women's rights, how do we translate his stance to today? Your approach to that question depends on whether or not you see his stance as a progressive attitude that would shift with times, or as a fixed point. Like, would Jesus be down with women in the workforce, or is women talking in public as far as Jesus is willing to go? It's hard to interpret since a lot of what he said about women was in response to specific social norms that aren't really a part of American politics anymore. So with my current biblical literacy, I found it hard to make a convincing case either way, so I decided against covering that side of the topic. But if that sounds interesting to you, let me know down below and I'll consider it for a future video. With those qualifying points out of the way, let's continue. Part 2. Did Jesus say billionaires shouldn't exist? To begin our journey, let's start in Luke, chapter 5. A rich man tells Jesus he's been a good little boy, but Jesus says he's got to do one last thing before the rich man can get into heaven.
Sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven.
When the rich man hesitated to give up his wealth, Jesus exclaimed,
It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God.
Well, shit, that's pretty cut and dry. I guess heaven's an official no rich people zone. And it's important to highlight how direct he's being here. He's not saying, oh yeah, keep hoarding money and exploiting people, just donate some of it occasionally and you're fine by me. He requires total and complete relinquishment of your wealth. This story shows us the first reason conservatives might argue that Jesus is a dirty red commie. He demanded that people give up their money. There was clearly something about giving up your possessions and rejecting material items that appealed to him. I've seen folks try to say that Jesus just saw giving up money as a way to test your faith, not that he had anything against money on its own. But that stance is pretty clearly contradicted in Jesus' teachings. If we go back to the camel needle eye point, his wording suggests that wealth is a corrupting force, sinking its teeth into a person like a blood-sucking tick. This reading bears out elsewhere in his teachings.
No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
Here, the pursuit of wealth is posited as diametrically opposed to serving God. It's not just a benign thing that God wants you to give up if you're down for it. It's fundamentally at odds with the spiritual commitment God wants. And so giving up money wasn't just a test of faith, but a condemnation of wealth hoarding as a practice. Pulling a line from Paul, who, by the way, is not Jesus Christ, but was certainly influenced by him, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction.
The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil.
If we assume some shared values between Jesus and Paul and use the previous quotes as context, we can gather that Jesus saw money not only as an obstacle to enlightenment, but as a corrupting force that brings out the worst in people. This is not to say that Jesus hated people having nice things and only wanted us to be eating dirt out of a gutter, but it does mean that he'd probably take issue with the lavish lifestyles that Americans lionize, and were he ever to publicly take issue with them, he'd get labeled a commie for sure. This Jesus fellow just hates people being successful. He's jealous of them, I guess. Next, let's not forget, Jesus' forgiveness for rich people had prerequisites. When Jesus forgave adulterers, he didn't say, "You'll be forgiven, but only if you stop adultering." He just forgave them. I wouldn't be surprised if they went on to stop adultering, but that wasn't required for his forgiveness. But for rich folks, it was necessary that they denounce their wealth. Using the story from before, when the man wouldn't give up his money, Jesus responded not with forgiveness or kind words, but by saying that his salvation was near impossible. We see the inverse of that a few chapters beforehand. A rich man, Zacchaeus, approached Jesus and said, "Here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." It was at that point, only after renouncing his wealth and cheating, that he was forgiven. So obviously Jesus wants this commitment from every follower, but especially rich people. Jumping to the modern day, if somebody told rich Christians that they needed to give up half their money to be holy, not just 10%, a threshold that many rich people don't even meet, they would absolutely call that person a communist. "You see, this Jesus fellow, socialist that he is, simply cannot understand the societal value that comes from me investing a small bit of my massive pile of gold occasionally. Oh, what a utopian fool." Oh, and don't even get Jesus started on what it would mean if rich people had to pay back folks they'd cheated. Perhaps the most obvious connection between Jesus' ministry and communism would be how his followers organized their finances. Jesus and his homies pooled together their money and used that communal purse for any costs that came up. And given as much as Jesus had to say against coveting material possessions, this strikes me as the ideal state for his followers during their time on Earth. There's something about the intimacy of the commune mixed with its mutual aid capabilities, mixed with its immediate relinquishing of possessions, that seems to appeal to Jesus, and it's a practice that stuck around through much of early Christianity. While transitioning to communal living, Jesus didn't just want rich people to throw their money away, he called for giving it to the needy. The Bible has long argued there's virtue in helping the poor. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Jesus kept that same energy, saying, "If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person?" Here we see that caring for the needy goes beyond just donations. You're called to be compassionate too. Some people take Jesus' stance on helping the poor as support for a tax-funded war on poverty, which is the part of the conversation where a conservative hops in and says, "Actually, Jesus advocated for charity, not taxes," which is where I jump into the conversation to remind folks it's difficult to map modern concepts onto historical moments. Taxes existed in Rome, and Jesus said his piece about them, but even the role of taxes was different back then. Aside from security, who received benefits was limited to citizens, and citizenship was heavily restricted. So even if we interpret Jesus as being against Rome's taxes, that's not to say he would be against a tax structure that benefited the masses. But even that counterpoint isn't enough to say Jesus would love a progressive tax structure. Again, comparisons between these two political realities are tough. What's interesting to me, though, is the fact that through this conversation, we're creating a false dichotomy that Jesus might not have been interested in. Again, and I really can't stress this enough, Jesus and his boys pooled resources together like a fucking hippie commune. He told everyone to sell all their shit and live together in an endless state of simply vibing. Luke describes the early church's resources as distributed to each as any had need, which is so close to Marx's from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, that it's impossible to ignore. This communal rejection of possessions in service of helping the needy goes beyond any discussion of charity versus taxation and feels damn near close to calling for the abolition of commodities, which is, last time I checked, about as communist as you can get. And for the record, this type of hippie-like communal approach would definitely be called impractical and commie-like today. If he asked all the rich Christians in the world to live in his desired communal fashion, he'd get a lot of hate in the media today. And not even just on Fox News. This is the type of anti-American statement that a lot of anchors on a lot of networks would take issue with this.
Michael, Joe Biden said yesterday that his campaign is Scranton versus Park Avenue. I don't live on Park Avenue, but I live pretty close to it. He doesn't want my vote.
Lastly, I want to engage in a bit of speculation, if I may be so bold. J-Man is hyper-focused on helping the poor. That seems to be one of his primary lessons for his followers. And as we see with his numerous interactions with folks society deemed lesser, he showered most everyone he met with kindness without a second thought. For this reason, I have a feeling he wouldn't be super down for the kinds of means-tested approaches to relief common in the US, or for our personal responsibility mantra. That isn't to say he didn't put the onus on individuals in their spiritual journey. To clarify my meaning on that one, but I'm referring to the codified political position of personal responsibility, which, among other societal harms, is an ideology that has folks blaming poor people for being poor.
The fact is that if you had to work more than one job to have a roof over your head or food on the table, you probably shouldn't have taken the job that's not paying you enough. That'd be a you problem.
I don't know about you, but that doesn't strike me as compassionate. Feels like J-Man would welcome anyone and their struggles with compassion, no matter their circumstance. And as far as means testing goes, I just can't see him standing up in front of folks and saying, "Sell your possessions and give to the poor." But of course only those poories that have worked at least 30 hours this week. I feel like he'd just want to give the needy what they need, whether they were satisfactorily productive in the market economy or not. And were he to oppose these ideas, as I suspect he would, he'd definitely get labeled a commie for being a giver of handouts or what have you. While there's certainly a lot more to this topic, so much so that it's filled dozens of books, that's about all I have to offer at time of recording. With that being said, let's wrap. Part 3. Conclusion. As we wrap up these holiday festivities, it's about time I answer the ultimate question of the video. Was Jesus a communist? It seems he's on his way to being one, with his communal approach and critiques of wealth hoarding. But generally speaking, I don't think his teachings present a clear stance of what we would call communist. Mainly because there's no label that quite feels right for his beliefs. But like I said at the top, it'd be a fool's errand to try and fit his teachings into some niche socialist field of thought. But even if no ideological label fits him perfectly, I do think his teachings present a sort of anti-capitalist critique. Or at the bare minimum, a critique of America's neoliberal status quo. He sees wealth hoarding not only as an obstacle to divinity, but as a negative trait in a person, whereas Republicans, and more broadly capitalists, build up the acquisition of money as virtuous in our culture. Jesus saw all his followers as equal in the eyes of God and worthy of salvation on the basis of being people, whereas many Americans seem to withhold the stamp of worthy of monetary assistance for those deemed sufficiently productive in the economy. Charity from rich, self-interested ghouls has proven unable to fix the ills of the world, something Jesus and his followers were fearful of. The politicians that defend to their grave a person's divine right to amass endless wealth also corner the market on being the mouthpieces of the Bible. And one of my biggest takeaways from this project is how utterly sad that fact makes me. Jesus would totally get called a commie by Americans today, not because he's an actual communist, but because the American political landscape has moved so far away from his compassionate message that his words sound fundamentally at odds with most of our policies. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to toss me one of them likes and subscribe down below, clicking the little bell so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Special shout out to all my patrons, like the lovelies whose names are currently on screen. These goofy goobers help keep this content train a-rollin'. Feel free to join me over on Patreon if you'd like to join them in supporting me. Links down in the description. Thanks much, and I'll see you next time.